For decades, Terry Whitfield built his entire identity on never losing an argument, using precision and proof as armor in a world that often tried to dismiss him. Now, in his late 50s, after a health scare and the memory of his father's early death, Terry starts doing something nobody in his family recognizes, walking away from arguments he could easily win. This video explores why so many Black Gen X men, once defined by the need to prove their point, begin choosing peace over being right, and what that quiet shift costs and finally gives back. It's a gray Saturday afternoon, the kind where the parking lot smells like rain that hasn't started falling yet, and Terrence Whitfield has already been standing at the customer service counter of a home improvement store in Bowie, Maryland, for 11 minutes. He's holding a receipt he's folded into quarters so many times the ink has started to crack. He has the store manager, a kid who can't be older than 26, backed into a logical corner with nowhere left to go. The delivery was 3 days late, the paperwork proves it, and Terry has already quoted the exact clause from the store's own policy that guarantees a refund on the delivery fee. This is a fight he has already won. He knows it, the manager knows it, and 30 years ago, the version of Terry Whitfield standing in this exact spot would have kept talking until the manager said the word sorry out loud. Instead, 58-year-old Terry closes his mouth around the winning argument, exhales through his nose and says, "It's all right, we'll figure it out." He unfolds the receipt, hands it back and walks toward the parking lot, leaving the manager standing there confused about what just happened. His son Malik is waiting in the car, phone in hand, and when Terry gets in and starts the engine without saying a word about it, Malik looks at him like he's just watched a stranger drive off in his father's body. "You had him," Malik says. "You had him dead to rights and you just let it go." Terry doesn't answer right away. He just pulls out of the parking lot, and for the first time in Malik's 33 years of life, he watches his father choose to lose an argument on purpose. For most of his life, Terrence Whitfield has been the guy who does not lose arguments. Not with contractors, not with insurance adjusters, not with his brother, not with anybody who thought they could outfact him. He spent 34 years as a construction superintendent in Prince George's County, the kind of job where being right isn't a personality trait. It's the only thing standing between a building that passes inspection and one that doesn't. People who have known Terry for decades say the same thing about him. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't get rattled. He just calmly produces the piece of information that ends the conversation. And now, somewhere in the last 2 years, that same man has started walking away from arguments he could still win in his sleep. His younger brother Rodney thinks something is wrong with him. His crew thinks he's checked out before retirement. Nobody around Terry Whitfield has considered the possibility that letting go of an argument might be the hardest, most disciplined thing he has ever done. 3 weeks before the incident at the store, Rodney called Terry about their mother's house, the one she left free and clear when she passed the year before. Rodney had a version of events about who paid down the mortgage in the final 10 years, and it was, by Terry's own paperwork, wrong. Terry had the bank statements. He had the canceled checks scanned into a folder on his laptop, dated and labeled the way he'd labeled every folder for 30 years. Old Terry would have sent that folder within the hour, attached to a message that made his brother feel 2 inches tall for being wrong in front of the family. This Terry sat with his laptop open, cursor blinking in an empty reply box, and closed it without sending anything at all. At work, his crew noticed something similar. An electrical sub tried to shortcut a conduit run that Terry knew violated code, the kind of mistake Terry used to stop cold in front of the whole crew, spec sheet in hand, voice flat and final. This time he pulled the sub aside quietly, said his piece once, and let it go instead of making an example out of him. "Old Terry would have ate that man alive," said Dominic Farrell, a foreman who'd worked under Terry for 11 years, in a good way. "He just don't do that no more." There is a running joke in the Whitfield family group chat about exactly this. For 20 years, if a cousin posted something wrong about a family date, an old recipe, or where somebody's wedding actually happened, Terry's reply used to read like a legal brief, complete with sources. These days he mostly just sends a thumbs up, and the family isn't sure whether to be relieved or slightly suspicious that somebody swapped him out for a chatbot. Nobody on that job site or in that group chat knew what to call the change. Rodney called it him getting soft over their mother's house. Dominic called it him coasting toward retirement. Denise, his wife of 31 years, was the only one who came close to naming it correctly, and even she wasn't sure at first if it was wisdom or exhaustion. There's a name for what Terry spent most of his adult life doing, and it comes out of research most people have never heard of. In 1983, a public health researcher named Sherman James interviewed 132 working-class black men in rural North Carolina about how they handled stress. He found a pattern he ended up calling John Henryism, named after the folk hero who beat a steam drill in a steel driving contest and then died from the sheer effort of proving he could. James described it as a strong, almost automatic belief that any obstacle, any barrier, any unfair situation could be overcome through sheer determination if a man just pushed hard enough. The men who scored highest on his scale weren't lazy or passive. They were the opposite. They were the most driven, most reliable, most on it men in their community. James found that the men who combined high John Henryism with lower income and education carried significantly higher blood pressure than everyone else in the study, even the men facing the exact same hardships who didn't push as hard. Later research kept finding the same pattern in black men working demanding jobs under constant scrutiny. The harder a man fought to control every outcome through effort and vigilance, the more his body quietly paid for it. For Terry, that toll had been showing up for years in small ways he'd learned to ignore. A tension headache after a hard sight meeting a fast pulse he could feel in his own ears during a heated negotiation, a jaw he sometimes realized he'd been clenching for an hour without noticing. None of it ever felt serious enough to mention to anybody, including himself. Terry Whitfield had never heard Sherman James's name in his life. He'd just been doing what James described for 40 years, and calling it being a man who takes care of business. Terry learned the shape of that determination from his father, James Whitfield, a man everybody in the neighborhood called Big Jim, who spent 26 years working the line at a steel plant outside Baltimore before it shut down in the early 1980s. Terry was 11 years old the first time he watched his father refuse to let something go. They were standing in a hardware store on a Saturday morning, and the clerk had shorted them 2 boxes of nails on a bulk order Big Jim had already paid for in full. The clerk waved it off as an honest mistake and told him to come back Monday, and Big Jim did not move from that counter. He asked calmly for the receipt to be pulled and re-added in front of him, item by item, out loud, until the shortage was undeniable to everyone standing in line behind them. It took 18 minutes. Terry remembers because he counted the second hand on the clock above the register out of boredom, then out of fascination, watching his father win a fight without ever raising his voice. On the drive home, Big Jim explained it in 6 words that stuck with Terry for the rest of his life. Round here, quiet gets you cheated. Big Jim had grown up watching black men lose arguments they were right about simply because they didn't have paperwork, didn't have witnesses, didn't have the kind of ironclad proof that made a disagreement impossible to wave away. So he taught his sons to never leave a room without the receipt, the paperwork, the documented, undeniable version of events. It wasn't paranoia. In the Baltimore of the 1970s, where a black man's word could be quietly discounted in 100 small transactions a week, it was closer to survival math. By the time Terry reached Suitland High School, he had turned his father's lesson into a personality. He joined the debate team not because he loved public speaking, but because it was the one place a black teenager could dismantle an opponent's argument piece by piece and get applauded for it instead of punished for it. His teammates started calling him Efficient Terry because he never used 10 words when 3 would win the point, and his coach used to say Terry could find the one weak plank in any argument the way other kids found the one weak defender on a football field. That skill followed him everywhere. Teachers learned not to mark him wrong without being ready to defend it. Classmates learned not to start something with him they couldn't finish. By 17, Terry Whitfield had built an identity around a simple equation. If he was right and he could prove it, nobody could touch him. It is worth saying clearly that none of this was a flaw in Terry. It was a smart, functional response to a world that required black boys to be twice as documented and twice as undeniable, just to be treated as simply correct. That equation followed him straight into a 34-year career in commercial construction, first as an apprentice electrician, then a foreman, then, for the last 15 years, a site superintendent responsible for buildings worth tens of millions of dollars. On a mixed-use project in Landover back in 2011, a city inspector tried to fail an entire floor's rebar layout over a spacing issue that would have cost the project 3 weeks and roughly $200,000 in delays. Terry pulled out the structural engineer's stamped drawings, walked the inspector foot by foot down the layout, and proved, calmly and completely, that the spacing matched the approved plans exactly. The floor passed that afternoon. The project stayed on schedule. Terry's reputation as the superintendent who could out-document, out-argue, and outlast anybody who challenged his work only grew stronger. For 34 years, that reputation was Terry's entire professional currency. Being right, and being provably right, was how a black man from Landover became one of the most trusted superintendents at his company, without ever needing anybody's permission to be taken seriously. It is not hard to understand why a man who built his entire livelihood on winning disputes would carry that same instinct home, into every disagreement with his wife, his brother, his kids, whether the stakes were $200,000 or whose turn it was to host Thanksgiving. There is a psychological concept, developed by researcher Claude Steele, called stereotype threat, the extra mental weight a person carries when they know a mistake from them will be read as confirmation of a stereotype, rather than just a mistake. For a black man on a job site, in a meeting, in a hardware store, that extra weight often translates into exactly what Big Jim taught his sons. Over-document, over-prepare, leave no room for anyone to question you. It is an intelligent adaptation to an unfair environment, and it worked. On a project in 2015, a subcontractor tried to claim Terry's crew had caused water damage that had actually existed before his team ever set foot on the floor. Terry's daily photo log, time-stamped and organized by floor, ended that dispute in under 10 minutes. That habit of documenting everything is also, according to a separate body of research, expensive to run for 40 years straight. Researcher Arlene Jeronimus described something called the weathering hypothesis, the idea that the chronic, cumulative stress of navigating a world that requires constant vigilance can age a body faster than the calendar does, showing up as elevated blood pressure, disrupted sleep, and a nervous system that never fully powers down. Terry never thought of himself as stressed. Stress was for men who couldn't handle things. He thought of himself as thorough. But thorough, sustained at full intensity for 4 decades, and stress can end up looking identical on a chart in a doctor's office. That vigilance showed up in habits nobody in the family thought twice about. Terry photographed every finished section of a job site before he left for the day, kept receipts organized by month going back 9 years, and read every piece of mail standing at the kitchen counter, instead of setting it aside for later. None of that looked like stress from the outside. It looked like a man being responsible. In March of last year, Terry's doctor read his blood pressure twice, waited 5 minutes, and read it a third time before saying the word concerning out loud. 158/98 is not an emergency. It is, by standard clinical guidelines, squarely inside stage 2 hypertension, the range where a doctor stops watching and starts treating. Terry sat on the exam table and did what he always did when someone told him something was wrong. He started building his case. He didn't smoke, he barely drank, he wasn't overweight, he walked 3 miles most mornings. His doctor, a woman who had treated him for 9 years, didn't argue with any of that. She just asked him a different question. Terry, how many arguments do you think you win in a day that you don't actually need to win? He didn't have an answer. For the first time in a long time, Terry Whitfield had been handed a question he couldn't out-document his way through. Here is the part of the story Terry didn't tell his doctor that day, the part that explains everything that happened after. Big Jim Whitfield died at 61 years old, 7 months after winning, decisively and on paper, an argument with his plant supervisor over a pension miscalculation that would have cost him nearly $4,000 a year in retirement. He fought that dispute for 8 months, filed the grievance himself, kept a binder of pay stubs going back a decade, and stood in a union hall and won every point in front of witnesses. 3 weeks after the company corrected his pension, Big Jim complained of chest tightness on a Tuesday night and was gone by Wednesday morning. Terry was 34 when it happened, and for years he told the story the way the family always told it. Big Jim Whitfield never backed down from anything, right to the very end. It took Terry until he was 57, sitting in his own doctor's office hearing the number 158/98, to hear that story differently for the first time. His father hadn't died in spite of never backing down. Some part of him, quietly, had died because of it, the same high-effort coping that Sherman James had spent his career studying, playing out one more time in one more Whitfield man's chest. Terry is 1 year younger right now than his father was the night his heart gave out. That fact sat with him longer than any argument ever had. Denise Whitfield married a man who could win any argument, and for a long time she thought that made her lucky. Then, somewhere around their 15th anniversary, she noticed she had quietly stopped bringing him certain things. Not big things, not affairs or debts, just small disagreements. Which contractor to trust for the kitchen remodel, whether to fly to Atlanta or drive, how a shared memory of a family trip had actually gone. Every time, Terry would build the airtight case for his position, complete with dates and details she couldn't always counter in the moment. And every time she would concede, not because she'd changed her mind but because arguing with Terry Whitfield felt like arguing with a courtroom. Their 25th anniversary trip almost didn't happen because of exactly this. Denise wanted Charleston. Terry had already researched flight prices, hotel reviews, and weather patterns proving Savannah was objectively the better choice, and he laid all of it out before she'd finished her sentence. She remembers sitting at their dining table that night, not angry, just tired, and saying something that took him years to actually hear. "I don't need you to be right, Terry. I need you to want what I want sometimes, even when it isn't the smartest choice on paper." They went to Savannah. It was, by every measure, a wonderful trip. It was also, Denise would say now, the moment she realized she had married a man who could win every argument in their marriage and still, somehow, end up lonely inside it. Malik has his own version of this story, from the other direction. When Malik was 12, a youth football referee wrongly ejected him from a game for a hit that clearly wasn't targeting, and Terry walked onto that field, calm and immovable, until the ejection was reversed in front of both sidelines. Malik remembers feeling like nothing in the world could touch him with his father standing there. He didn't yet understand that the same immovable calm that protected him that day was quietly costing his father something else entirely. There is a psychological theory that helps explain what eventually shifted in Terry, and it has nothing to do with race or hardship at all. It has to do with time. Stanford psychologist Laura Carstensen spent decades studying how people's priorities change as they age, and developed what's now known as socio-emotional selectivity theory. Her research found that when people perceive their remaining time as wide open, they chase future-focused goals: knowledge, achievement, proving themselves, building a reputation. But as people sense that time horizon narrowing, whether from age, a health scare, or simply watching people around them get sick and die, something reorganizes inside them. They start prioritizing goals that pay off emotionally right now instead of goals that might pay off someday. And researchers following this theory have found something specific and almost tender. Older adults become measurably more willing to forgive people in the middle of a conflict than younger adults are. Not because they've gotten weaker, because winning has quietly stopped being the point. Terry never read Laura Carstensen's research. He just felt his own time horizon narrow the day his doctor said stage 2, and the day he did the math on his father's age. And somewhere underneath all of that, an old tired part of him finally agreed with a truth his body had been trying to tell him for years. Being right and being at peace were never actually the same prize. The shift didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in small, deliberate rehearsals, the same way Terry had once rehearsed arguments. He started letting Denise finish a story wrong without correcting the date. He let a rookie electrician make a call on the job that Terry would have made differently, then watched it work out fine anyway. He noticed, for the first time in decades, that most of the arguments he used to fight to the finish weren't actually about facts at all. They were about control, about being seen as the man who couldn't be got over on. Denise likes to joke that the biggest renovation of the last 2 years wasn't the kitchen. It was watching her husband survive an entire family dinner without correcting anybody's math on how old Cousin Pam's twins actually are. That realization didn't make Terry passive. He still corrects a genuinely dangerous code violation the second he sees one. He still keeps his paperwork. The instinct that protected him for 40 years hasn't disappeared, and it shouldn't, because some fights are still worth having in full. What changed is that Terry finally started sorting his fights into 2 piles instead of 1. The ones that actually mattered, and the ones that were just his old habit looking for a reason to prove itself again. He's also started mentoring the younger tradesmen on his crew differently. Instead of correcting a mistake in front of the group the way he used to, he pulls a young apprentice aside, shows him the fix once, and lets him keep his dignity in front of his coworkers. The clearest test of that new sorting system came with Rodney, 3 weeks before the trip to the hardware store. Rodney's version of the mortgage payments on their mother's house was wrong, and Terry knew it down to the dollar, because Terry had co-signed the refinance in 2009 and still had the closing documents in a folder labeled in his own handwriting, "Mom's house, do not lose." The old Terry would have sent that folder within the hour, attached to a message that ended the conversation permanently and made Rodney feel foolish in front of the rest of the family. This time Terry opened his phone, typed out the correction line by line, paperwork citations and all, and read it back to himself twice. Then he deleted the whole thing, 1 word at a time, and called his brother instead. "Whatever you remember it being," Terry said when Rodney picked up, "let's just split it the way you think is fair. It's Mama's house. I don't need to win this one." There was a long pause on the line. Rodney, who had been bracing for a fight his older brother had never once lost, didn't know what to do with a version of Terry who wasn't interested in winning at all. They ended up splitting the proceeds down the middle, which was, by the actual paperwork, more than what Rodney was technically owed. Terry knew that. He let it go anyway, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, a phone call between the Whitfield brothers ended in laughter instead of a tally of who was right. It would be easy to mistake this for Terry simply getting older and losing his edge, the way Rodney did, the way his crew did. But there's a difference between a man who's too tired to argue and a man who's decided which arguments are actually worth what they cost him. Terry Whitfield can still, in under 2 minutes, dismantle a bad argument down to the studs. He just doesn't feel the need to do it every time he technically could, which brings the story back to a parking lot in Bowie, Maryland, and a receipt folded into quarters. Malik didn't understand what he saw that day, not right away. He grew up watching his father win. He learned how to argue by watching Terry argue, and some part of him had built his own sense of respect for his father entirely around that skill. So when Terry walked away from a fight he had already won, Malik's first thought wasn't pride. It was worry. It took a long car ride and an honest conversation, the kind Terry never used to have room for in the middle of an argument, for Malik to understand what his father had actually done. "I used to think being right was the whole job," Terry told him, somewhere past the Beltway. "Now I think being at peace is the job, and being right is just something I still happen to be most of the time." That night back at the house, Terry sat down at his desk with the folded receipt from the hardware store still in his jacket pocket. For 34 years, he'd had a filing system for exactly this kind of thing. A folder, a label, a permanent record of every time he'd been right and could prove it. He looked at the receipt for a long moment, then dropped it in the trash can beside his desk instead, unfiled, unarchived, unnecessary. It is a small thing. It is also, for a man who spent his whole life keeping the proof, close to the bravest thing Terry Whitfield has ever done. Denise, watching from the doorway, didn't say anything either. She'd waited a long time to see her husband put something down without a fight, and she wasn't about to argue him out of it. Somewhere in Prince George's County tonight, there's a man who spent 40 years being undeniably right, finally learning that the quietest room in his life is the one where nobody has to admit he won. He is not softer. He is not slower. He simply decided, one folded receipt at a time, that peace was worth more than being able to prove he never lost. If you know a man like Terry, the one who can win every argument and still walk away tired, this one's for him. He might not say much back. He'll probably still understand it.